Hello and welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist Ben Gallagher. This video is Respiration 1. It's the first in the respiration sequence and it covers the process overview. I've also included a cells review section in here because it's been a while since we looked at cells as key structures and what they do, so I thought that would be a useful input here. It's suitable for GCSE level, and I would very strongly recommend that you've watched the photosynthesis lessons just before you watch this. This is really a follow-on from photosynthesis because photosynthesis and respiration are the two key biochemical processes in cells, and combined together they're known as bioenergetics. If you do like my videos and you like what you see, I would please ask that you subscribe to my channel. It really does help me out the more subscriptions I can get. So let's answer the question, what is respiration? Now, this is why I said it was so important that you've just watched the photosynthesis presentations and that you're really familiar with photosynthesis as a biochemical pathway. Because photosynthesis just trapped sunlight energy in molecules of glucose. The chlorophyll molecules act as a catalyst in the palisade cells to grab hold of that sunlight energy, lock it up in a molecule of glucose which they've built using carbon dioxide and water. That's such an essential piece of understanding to move on and understand respiration with, because respiration is just a chemical reaction to get the energy back out of glucose. So photosynthesis locked it up. Respiration is just the way that has evolved to break that glucose back open to get the energy so the cell can use it. So let's look at that as a biochemical pathway. What we've got here, we know from what I've just said, it's glucose and you're trying to get the energy back out of it. So that's what's going on in this equation. Now, to get the energy out of it, you need to react glucose with the oxygen that was given off as a waste product when it was built. When glucose and oxygen react together, you should get the energy and the products. But let's just put the symbols for those. Glucose, you need to know, is C6H12O6. That's 6 carbons. And react that with 6 oxygen molecules, which is the same that was given off through photosynthesis. What you'll get is the carbon dioxide and water reformed. In other words, respiration is the exact chemical reverse of photosynthesis, but we don't need the chemical catalyst happening now. This reaction will happen more easily. The glucose and oxygen will react together, break open that glucose, release its energy, and the atoms that were left over will reform the carbon dioxide and water molecules. Now, because, just as a little convention here, you'll notice directly above my head, I've just put the energy into brackets. They weren't there before, I've just added them on now. This is something I'd like you to get used to doing. It's not an essential convention, but there's two types of things in the entire universe. There's matter and there's energy. Matter is actual stuff, energy is energy. Okay, there's lots of forms of energy, but it's very different to matter. So in the equation, I'd like you to get used to putting the energy bit in brackets just to show that it's a little bit separate. It's not a chemical that's taking part in this reaction. If you study this at A level, you'll see that actually it gets locked up in another little molecule called ATP. But for the time being, let's just think about it being the energy that's being released from that glucose. Now, because this reaction requires oxygen from the air, this is known as aerobic respiration. You can break glucose down and get the energy out of it without the use of oxygen. That's called anaerobic respiration. We'll be looking at that in the second respiration presentation, which focuses on exercise. Because this reaction gives out energy as well, it's known as an exothermic reaction. So photosynthesis, which took the energy in, is endothermic. Now that we're going to release that energy or let it exit, this is called exothermic. Okay, now this is probably a really good slide to take a screenshot of that you can add to your notes, because it's got a lot of the key information on respiration. So I suggest you take a screenshot now, and then we can move on to the next slide. So as I said in the introduction, we're going to use this lesson as well to review some of the cell biology. The reason we're doing that is because it's so essential to understand where in the cell respiration happens and how that affects the cell as a whole. So it's important to know that in eukaryotic cells, aerobic respiration happens in the mitochondria. Anaerobic respiration happens in the cytoplasm, so we're not going to worry about that for the time being. Let's focus on aerobic respiration. Now, given that aerobic respiration is the main way that cells get all that energy back out of the glucose molecules, that means that the number of mitochondria inside a cell is directly related to how energetically active that cell is. So for example, a muscle cell, which might be working very, very hard, is likely to have lots and lots and lots of mitochondria to do lots of aerobic respiration and provide all of the energy it needs for those muscle contractions for movements. Now, if we just think very quickly about prokaryotic cells, remember that prokaryotic cells don't have mitochondria. It doesn't mean they don't do respiration. Doesn't even mean that they can't do aerobic respiration. It just means that they do both aerobic and anaerobic respiration in their cytoplasm. Now, let's have a look. Let's not worry about prokaryotes at this stage. Let's focus just on eukaryotic cells, and let's look at a basic eukaryotic animal cell. Now, that picture that's just popped up should look very familiar from our cell biology lessons. It's the same diagram that we used in there. Now, that cell needs to do one key thing if it's going to stay alive, and that isn't respiration. If you remember back to those lessons and the follow-up lessons on proteins, you'll remember that the most important thing that a cell must do is make proteins, because those proteins are the little machines and structures that do everything in the cell. As long as a cell can make its proteins, those proteins will carry out all the millions of little tasks that need to happen. So a cell is set up to build those proteins so the proteins can do everything for it. So such an important point. It's a theme running through all of my lessons, is that proteins do everything. Please remember that. So let's now look at this cell as to how it's set up to build those proteins, and then we can add the respiration locations in on that. Let's just fade that cell away to white so that we can start up afresh. So building the cell up as to how it's structured and how it's evolved to maximize its protein synthesis, we need to think about the essential things that are required. So firstly, the physical things. If a cell is going to be a cell, the two most important things it needs is the cell membrane to go around the outside to give it a skin, to make it a compartment that's unique and separate to everything else. And then it needs to have a filling for that, which is the cytoplasm, the liquid that fills it up, gives it shape and structure, but really importantly, creates a medium through which all of the little chemicals can float around and react with each other. So you often see cytoplasm described as being the site of chemical reactions. Well, it is, because it's the liquid that allows all the chemicals to float around and get to each other. But those two things are essential for actually physically having a cell. However, it still needs to make its proteins. And there's only two things that a cell needs to make those proteins. It's DNA, which come in structures called chromosomes, and ribosomes, because chromosomes are the instructions for how to build proteins, and ribosomes are the little workers, the little mechanics that actually follow the instructions and put the proteins together. Once that protein is made, the ribosome can release it to wherever it needs to go, and that protein will go and do its job. Its job may be to carry out the respiration reactions. But as long as you've got those four things currently displayed on this diagram, then you've got a cell that can function to produce its proteins to keep it going. Now, in terms of evolution, that's basically where prokaryotic cells stopped. If you think back to what we've looked at with prokaryotes, they're just a membrane full of cytoplasm with DNA and ribosomes. Their DNA is very different to eukaryotic DNA. It's same in terms of its monomer units, its chemical structure, but instead of linear chromosomes, which you can see on our diagram, linear just means they've got a beginning and an end, so they're strands. Instead of linear chromosomes like eukaryotic cells, they have loops. They have circular DNA or circular chromosomes. But otherwise, prokaryotes are basically what you're looking at on the screen here. That's everything you need to make the proteins. But eukaryotes kept on evolving and kept on adding refinements to this design. So one of the first things that they did was that they thought that DNA is really, really important. If we lose that DNA, we lose the instructions for how to make our proteins. And without those proteins, we can't do things. So let's protect them. Let's wrap them up in a protective bag of membrane. That's all the nucleus is. It's a bag of membrane that houses the DNA, which are the instructions for how to make the protein. So the nucleus holds and protects the DNA, which is found on those structures that are the chromosomes. Now, this is the key bit for respiration. Eukaryotic cells also have these mitochondria. Now, there's one theory that you'll cover at A level called endosymbiotic theory, that eukaryotic cells absorbed little prokaryotes, which basically turned into mitochondria, and it made those little prokaryotes its servants to do all its respiration. But whether that theory is true or not, what we know is that mitochondria are the site of aerobic respiration. So all those little mitochondria that I've added on the diagram there, those are doing the respiration to provide the energy, in large part, for protein synthesis, for making those proteins so those proteins can do everything. And all the things those proteins do may require energy, so that also is provided by aerobic respiration in the mitochondria. Now, one thing I'm going to add to this diagram that's quite often left off animal eukaryotic cells is this small temporary vacuole. Vacuoles are always used for storage, but animal cells can have vacuoles too. It's really common that students say to me, when we're talking about differences between plant and animal cells, that plant cells have a vacuole, animal cells don't. That's not true. Plant cells have a large permanent vacuole. Animal cells can have small temporary ones. Easy way to try and think about that is a plant cell's vacuole is like a massive cupboard that you've got in a room. It's big, it's always there, it's not going anywhere. You can take stuff out, you can put stuff in, it's a great storage container. The small temporary ones are more like a little cardboard box that you've got. You can quickly fold up a little cardboard box, store stuff in it. Once you've emptied it, you can go, oh, I'll chuck that, don't need it anymore. Okay, they're small, they're temporary, but they're still useful for storage. Now, just to remind you again, I'll flash up there that proteins do everything. What I'd like us to now look at, though, is if we can transfer this animal cell into a plant cell. So let's just get rid of the cell membrane. Let's also get rid of that small temporary vacuole that we've just said you don't find in a plant cell. And let's cross out animal and put plant. So let's just transfer this into being a plant cell. Now you can see I've left the nucleus, I've left the ribosomes, I've left the mitochondria. Those are still key structures that you find in a plant cell. But plant cells have some very key different things as well. For one, they've got this cellulose cell wall. Now you should have already watched the osmosis lessons, especially the examples in osmosis, and seen that the cellulose cell wall is largely to prevent a cell from bursting and to allow the cell to become turgid and solid for structural reasons. So for that reason, you can see that the membrane here on our plant cell is pressed out closely against the cell wall. It was more rounded or of random shape in the animal cell, but now it's pressed out against that cell wall. But the cell membrane still has exactly the same function. It's the skin of the cell, and it allows things to move in and out of the cell. Now, if we continue the change on this to being a plant cell, we can add the large permanent vacuole as opposed to the small temporary one. We can also add chloroplasts, which we know from the photosynthesis lessons are the site of photosynthesis. But all we did there was change a few things, and we turned an animal cell into a plant cell because they're very, very closely related. They're both eukaryotic cells. They both need to do very, very similar processes. But in terms of respiration, they both need to have those mitochondria that allow them to do aerobic respiration to get the energy back from glucose. So we're almost done on respiration, but let's just look at one final key question. How do cells use the energy they get from respiration? Well, there's several things that they would do with this, and we've already discussed some of them. The first key thing is in synthesis reactions. Now, synthesis means making things. So protein synthesis was the key thing that I talked about. But there's loads of things that a cell needs to synthesize, loads of things it needs to make to keep it running. Now, as well as synthesis reactions, you've also got breakdown reactions, where you've got some substances that you don't want anymore, or you need their component parts, and you need to break them down. So breakdown reactions literally means breaking things. So we've got two types of reaction there, a making things and a breaking things. Now, those two things together can be combined into what we call metabolism. The metabolism are all the synthesis and breakdown reactions that are going on inside a cell that show that it is alive, that it's a living cell. So metabolism, making stuff and breaking stuff, is the key feature to show that that cell is living and is alive. Both of those things require energy provided by the respiration. But of course, another example we've already mentioned is that you need energy from muscle contractions so you can move yourself around. You also need energy to provide heat to maintain body temperature. And lastly, you need some of that energy for active transport. Now, if you think back to the transport through membranes unit that we covered, active transport is where you're moving substances against the concentration gradient. So you're trying to push them in a direction they don't want to go in. That pushing requires energy. So those are the 5 key reasons why a cell requires energy. It's the 5 key things that a cell is going to do with that energy provided by respiration. So a final recap of that earlier screen of what is respiration. It's essentially just a way that the cells get the energy back out of the glucose molecule. They're trying to claim back that sunlight energy that was originally locked up through photosynthesis. If it uses oxygen and liberates a lot of energy from the glucose, it's called aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration doesn't use oxygen and gives you less of the energy back. But because respiration does give energy out, it's an exothermic reaction. Now, as I said at the start, this was the first part in the respiration presentations. The second one is on exercise and includes details of anaerobic respiration and a human physiology overview to see how you get the oxygen and the glucose required for respiration. So please go and watch that. And as ever, if you've enjoyed this presentation and you want to be kept updated as to when new material is uploaded to my site, then please do go and press the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.